welcome to episode 19 of Last Turn, and happy Hallows End, champions. How are you enjoying the arena expansion, Evan?
Oh man, I mean, honestly, I think the best the gameplay is great, and getting to make a two class deck, just kind of something I think a lot of people, including myself, always wanted to do.
Oh yeah.
Like the taste that they gave us in Mean Streets was like not very much.
No, not at
A
all.
lot of the cards wound up the multi-class cards wound up not feeling like multi-class cards. They just kind of felt like neutral cards.
Totally.
And you usually forget that you can't use them in certain decks. Like, oh, I'm going to put Kazakus in my Hunter deck. Oh, wait. Like, that happened multiple times. Like I just keep forgetting like a goldfish. But the costumes.
Oh, yeah.
The
art is great.
The characters, rather. The heroes. The heroes are they're amazing.
Yeah,
I think it's worth
I like
it just
that a
for
lot.
that.
I like how they redid the art and the characters. I think my favorite one is probably Valera. She has like little cat ears.
Yeah, I was going to go with Valyria as well.
Yeah, it's adorable. It's a really cool game mode. It's like, I know we've all thought about those 2-card, cross-class combos, and then you think, all right, well, how can Rogue pull this off, But it's pretty cool to actually be able to have a deck filled with cards from 2 classes and play a game of Arena like that. It seems very powerful.
Yeah, I think a lot of the decks wound up being strong, but nothing has seemed overpowered. So it seemed really balanced. Like I didn't have too many really games that were completely one way because someone did something completely overpowered. Cards like Obsidian Shard are definitely really good.
Oh yeah,
and Mage is still really good. Mage cards are still really good, and the Mage Hero Power is still really good in Arena.
Yeah.
So that sort of hasn't changed, but because every deck I think it's more balanced. It's how the medium area of rolling 2 dice, which is a 7.
Right.
You're less likely to get that 7 than the medium area on 20 6-sided dice.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah,
the medium zone, I guess, not the exact number, but it's the more that you add, the more averaged it is. So since each deck has 2 classes, I think it's sort of that allows you to shore up the weaknesses. The classes that don't have removal or don't get enough removal can pair up with Mage and Rogue, and vice versa. Priest can pair up with Rogue or Druid and get obnoxious minions.
Yeah, I mean there's effectively like 72 classes, right? There's the 9 times 8. So I think certainly some combinations of those classes probably win more often than others, but it hasn't been totally obvious to me what those combinations are, because I think they depend on common card synergies and also individual card power level. But it's nice that it's not just like Mage plus X is the best or Druid plus X. Of course, we're seeing a lot of that or Paladin plus X, because those are good classes that have good cards in them. But yeah, I've like you, I've seen a lot of all kinds of nonsense, and I've seen all kinds of nonsense do really well.
Yeah, so the most degenerate thing I saw was a Mage Rogue with Obsidian Shards and Fireballs. So if I had to guess a top of the 72, I'd probably pick that or put that near it. It's just 2 of the best Arena classes.
Yep, yeah, Rogue does already has synergies with other classes' cards, and that's very powerful when other classes' cards are in your 30.
And then either Mage with the Warlock Hero Power or Priest with the Warlock Hero Power is pretty stupid.
Yeah, definitely. Having access to a non-Warlock card pool but being able to life tap is really good. Priest is a great example, because they have stuff like Greater Healing Potion and even just minions that enter the battlefield, or Paladin with Warlock hero Power, where you have Ivory Knight. Geez, that's everything you want.
Yeah, the only thing that you're missing in Paladin control is consistent draw.
Yeah.
So and Paladin is one of the best Arena classes because of cards like Spikered Steed.
Totally.
It's very possible that's something that's way up there too.
Yeah.
and it's sort of new format, so being more aggressive is really good. But eventually, people will probably figure out exactly the best combo.
Yeah.
Though it's still like getting exactly the best combo won't be that common.
Yeah, of course, because there's 72 combos, and they're not like you're it's pretty low that you encounter any given combo in a that you get to play any given combo in a particular game of Arena, right? Because you have to like choose 3 out of 9 and then get the one class you want, and then choose 3 out of 8 and get the other class you want, and that's
Yeah, you need to win that twice, and certain ones like the Warlock one, order matters.
yeah, it's a
Like
permutation, not just a combination.
Warlock Paladin with the Paladin hero power is not nearly as impressive, I don't think.
Yeah, so actually, when I say there's 72 classes, it's actually like twice that, right? Because it's going to be 9 times 8 times 2. It's like 9 times 8 plus 9 times 8, because it'll be like
Hmm.
Shaman Warlock and then Warlock Shaman, which are different classes.
Yeah,
So
because of the order mattering.
yeah, so that's pretty cool though. I mean, having all of these options on the table and not really nearly enough time to break it makes it seem super fresh and fun.
Yeah, it's really well done, I
Yes.
think, and it's really cool how smoothly everything is fitting together. I think this is like for them kind of a test run,
Oh,
or
like
at
a tour
least
de force.
I hope they treat it like that. Like this is something that they've probably talked about a lot. Um, and if they just introduced a whole bunch of cards that were like this and it didn't work, it could be a really big problem.
Yes.
Or changed a bunch of things. So, and also, it's satiating our thirst because this is probably something people whine at them about all the
Oh
time
yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So this is maybe they're like, there's like all the sharks in the water, and they're like throwing the chum in a little bit
Yeah.
just to keep them down for now. But hopefully, it would be really cool if they took this further.
Yeah, I
And
mean
the
it's
fact that it seems really smooth right now, like right now, it seems like I said, really balanced, really smooth. That's a good sign.
yeah, I think it's I agree. It definitely everything seems like it's functional, which is like level 1 when you're talking about a game, which is great. This card, I think this card game and this game in general is really pretty glitch free. But um the aside from spectating, that's glitch filled. Uh but I do agree that everything looks, pretty balanced from here. It seems nice because I know a while ago they were doing an arena promotion like in the middle of the summer with like the like the Ragnaros festival or whatever they called it.
Yeah, the Summer Fire Fest. That's not it. I don't remember.
It definitely had fire. It was definitely summer. So they tried to do like arena promotions in that time. It was before Frozen Throne came out, and now this seems like another type of arena promotion that is like working. A lot of my friends' list is in the arena playing people I don't usually see there. So
Like me.
yeah, same. And me, I almost never play arena.
Yeah,
I draft a deck and then sit on it for months.
dude. I like the past two times the set came out. Like months into the set, I went to the arena and I had a deck from before that set came out. I was like, uh oh.
Oh, that's awesome.
Am I gonna be like at a huge advantage or huge disadvantage? It's usually the second thing. Just so
Right. You need sludge belchers and piloted treaders to be at a huge advantage.
Yeah, nothing was from that far back.
Oh, rip. So I guess we can move into today's topic. So we wanted to talk about statistics in Hearthstone. So specifically, a lot of us will spend time outside of the game, looking at websites like Vicious Syndicate or HS Replay or even the competitive Reddit, and like Hearthpwn and those types of websites.
And many more.
And many more. Yeah, there's a whole lot of Hearthstone statistical websites. So these all present, statistics on dex functions and win rate, matchup win rates and average win rates, and statistics on individual cards like drawn win rates and played win rates. So all of these pieces of information are informative, but there's caveats in all of them. So some of them are much more informative than others, and we wanted to talk a little bit about which ones we think are the most informative and why we think the others are less informative. So what are the problems and which problems are really deal breakers? And
Mhm.
we also wanted to try to give you an intuition for some of these problems because, this is all statistic stuff. Like some of this is pretty dense and not obvious, and there's a lot of research that goes in psychology that shows that people are sort of bad at dealing with probabilities mentally. That we make all sorts of repeatable, sort of consistent errors when we try to intuit about probability information. So just going a little bit deeper into the statistics and discussing it in sort of a principled way might help out all of us.
Statistics are extremely fun.
Oh yeah, they're near and dear to my heart.
They're one of the best things, and but they can ultimately, if like, there's a worst case scenario where a statistic leads you wrong and actually hurts you. That's another thing that, like, it's it's not just an innocent thing. You're playing with fire right now, and we don't want you getting burned.
Yep, yeah, that's exactly it. Is that all of these statistics are meaningful. They definitely mean something, but whether they're useful is a different question, and we want to dive into that.
It can depend on all sorts of stuff. Well, what time it is.
Yeah.
Or all sorts of things.
Yeah. So, the first ones we want to discuss are pretty straightforward. These are the kinds of stats that you would expect in any game and are one of the first things you see in Hearthstone. So we want to talk about average deck win rates and matchup win rates. So these are statistics about entire decks, and they're telling you about that deck's performance against the field or against a particular card in the field. So,
or a particular deck?
A particular deck, yes. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
A particular deck in the field.
Blue Eyes White Dragon.
Yeah, Shaman versus Dark Magician. We wanted to start with matchup win rate. This is, I think, a little bit more basic than an average deck's win rate, even though average deck win rate is probably simpler. I think that to understand it fully, you should understand matchup win rate. So this is just this fraction of games in which deck X is supposed to beat deck Y. That's all. If you have some deck X and some deck Y, matchup win rate is going to be the probability that X beats Y. So that's really straightforward. And there's actually not a whole lot of caveats in this stat. I mean, how useful do you find this statistic, Evan?
Well, so that depends on if I think something is particularly common. Mm-hmm. Like this matchup win rate statistic, I think, for example, maybe didn't mean as much in the Ungoro meta when there were many, many strong decks. And that average deck, or the matchup win rates was something I was looking at less. But lately it's something I've been looking at a lot because there have been particular decks that were really popular.
Definitely.
So if usually actually the very first thing I would look at is the next thing we're going to talk about, which is the average deck win rate, and whatever has the highest, that is generally what I'm going to play. So that was Tempo Rogue. So that's how I picked that. But after I got tired of that deck and eventually I couldn't get anywhere with it, I looked at the matchup win rates, and I had seen a lot of it. So then I looked at the matchup win rate, what beats this deck that I've been just seeing constantly. And that was very helpful.
That's how I tend to use it also. I tend to, when I encounter a deck or a small set of decks that are very popular, it's often really helpful to look at to study the matchup win rate grid and find the green column, So like there's a particular deck that you want to beat, and you want to find a deck that beats that deck, like, and a bunch of the other decks that you see a bunch, that has like a favorable matchup against all of those decks. You want to try to find that deck.
And there's like generally a lot of these numbers are close to 50-50, like it'll be 52-48 or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Anything like 60-40 is like pretty uncommon. That will happen in the case of maybe like Quest Mage versus something.
Right.
I mean, I bet that maybe like the Jade Druid versus Quest Mage might be below 40. I don't really know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It could be that bad. So how much of an edge, it's gonna vary, and it's usually not like a huge number. You still have to play well.
Yeah, that's sort of one of the only caveats with something like matchup win rate is that the player skill is folded in here. So one way that we mitigate this is a lot of us will often look at matchup win rates within a particular ELO bracket. So I know that VS does this, and I think HS Replay has this feature as well. But I think it might be a premium feature if it's there. But anyway, restricting your analysis to only decks that occur within a specific rank range will tell you a lot about. It'll tell you something like the matchups, like true, quote unquote, win rate. True win rate is not something that. Well, I guess it really depends on. It depends here. There's sort of two true win rates. That'd be the average over every single Hearthstone game that's ever been played. Within a particular time window, or there's like the ideal, like you have the supercomputer playing in supercomputer, and what is the win rate over an infinite number of games in that case. So those are true win rates. We're never going to observe those, but looking at relatively high level play and the matchup statistics there in a sample of high level play is going to get you something pretty close. But yeah, like you said, a win rate of 60% is like enormous in this game.
Yeah, that's astronomical.
That is huge.
That means that that's a counter, like in the example of Quest Mage versus something that dirtles far too much to beat it very frequently, like Jade Druid.
Yeah, or like Quest Rogue versus like some priest control deck or something.
The other thing that you can do is look at maybe two decks, like Priest and Rogue are very popular. You can look at something that beats both of those. That's just like another thing to use the matchup win rate for.
Yes.
Or if there's something that just particularly bothers you and you want to beat it every time. Or rather, if there is a deck that you've been losing to, rather than changing what deck you're playing, you can at least look at what's beating it. Is it aggro decks that are beating this deck you're losing to? You can maybe make your deck a little faster or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. These are all none of these are sort of like the 10 commandments, right? That's not what these matchup win rates are. A lot of them are pliable, and you can adjust them around by teching your deck in different ways. So if you have a vector of matchup win rates, you can imagine that you can move some of them up and some of them down by changing out cards. And that's a good way to think about that. So if you happen to like a deck a lot, but it has some bad matchups that are relatively common, you can just tech in some cards that will improve that. So that's like the way that your deck building skill can factor into all of this. Obviously, when you make a tech decision, you're not really going to know how much it improves your exact statistics. Nobody's going to tell you, oh, well, you're going to lose 3% here, but gain 5 here.
Like if you put Galaka Crawlers in because your 1 week matchup, it looks like is Pirates.
Yeah.
Like how much more games are you going to win on average? Like that's really hard to say.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody's really going to be able to tell you that unless you're sort of collecting your own data and you have a lot of it, or your group like HS Replay that has millions and millions of games, such that they can analyze your list or the list you're thinking about teching into and compare those to each other and have a reasonable sample size.
And then, you also need to factor in how often you're going to see the pirate deck versus how often you're going to see a different deck that makes you wish you didn't tech in Galactic Crawlers.
So that's actually a good transition to average deck win rate, I think, because that is the biggest caveat with average deck win rate is how much information is folded in, frequency information that's folded in. So average deck win rate is it's just the fraction of games the deck X is expected to win. So given that you press the play button, what's the probability that you're going to win the game? Based on a sample. So that seems simpler than something like matchup win rate because I said like fewer words to describe it, but there is a lot more information folded into it. So that it has more caveats than something like matchup win rate. So typically when thinking about these statistics and statistics in general, it helps to decompose them into what produces those statistics. So in this case, this is a weighted average of a deck's matchup win rates where the weights are the frequency of each individual deck. So what that means is a deck's average win rate can change if no cards in the deck change and if the frequency of a deck in the field changes. So, you imagine you're playing Tempo Rogue, and Tempo Rogue has a really good matchup against like what is a really good matchup for that? Maybe like, I don't know, Priest?
Rogue beats Jade Druid pretty well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So Jade Druid. So let's say you're playing Rogue and you do well against Jade Druid. If you change no cards in your deck, your average win rate's going to increase if the frequency of Jade Druid increases. And, of course, because the frequencies have to add to 1, if Jade Druid's frequency increases, all the other frequencies will decrease. So that's there's a lot of information folded in there. There's all of your matchup win rates and the field frequency win rates. It's still a useful statistic because it's telling you, because sometimes you want all that information folded in, but it's definitely not the be all end all.
Yeah, and something you mentioned about the matchup win rate is like you can look at different sets of ranks, which I think is really important. That was something I underestimated, like looking not just like the total average, but the average at my specific rank or in my rank area.
Right.
Because it really can vary pretty widely. Like if you look at like the distribution of decks at the legend level, it's very often like sort of like a jump from rank 1.
Right.
And it can be completely different from everything else. So if what you're doing is looking at a bunch of decks that get legendary and a bunch of streamers that are on the legend ladder and what decks they're playing, that could really mislead you.
Oh yeah,
like, that's
totally.
not even statistics, but that's sort of like the Twitch version of what we're talking about, because these are they got legend, so they had a really good win rate. But whatever they're playing at legend is not what they played to get legendary. Most of the time. And so looking, at specifically what decks are working at your rank, and trying to beat that rather than the average number or being misled by legendary decks is really important.
Yeah, I think so too.
And like another thing that would affect my decisions is how much more. Is there more rogue or is there more priest at my rank? And is there a lot of Jade Druid or not very much? Is there a lot of Paladin or not very much? Usually the answer is not very much, fortunately. The Murloc Paladin deck was tough for me.
Yeah, the frequency information will definitely change. It definitely varies a bunch by rank. I mean, I know that the difference between 5 and 1 in Legend tends to be pretty big, like you mentioned, but that affects average win rate a lot. If you have, so imagine that a new deck got introduced into the field somehow, and that had its set of its own matchup win rates, and let's say it had actually pretty favorable matchups against some of the best decks, but unfavorable matchups against like less popular decks, then that would probably shake up the deck frequency distribution a lot, and that would change an average deck's win rate a lot. And even if you changed no cards in that deck, its win rate would change a lot because the whole field would have been shaken up.
Yep. I mean, it's not a new deck, but the Murloc Paladin deck is, for example, doing really well legendary right now.
Yeah.
At this very moment, but I don't think it's much more common at the other ranks yet.
Yes, I agree. That information does not trickle down.
Yep, I was going to say trickle down, Murgle down.
The Murgle down economics.
Dude, that would be quite a character, and a Murloc economist.
Oh yeah, it'd be like some kind of like auctioneer or something.
I mean, imagine like the stock exchange on Wall Street, but it's all Murlocs. That would be really hilarious.
I would love a card that's like a Murloc in a suit with like a stick pointing to a chart that just has like a line that's sort of zigzagging upwards. Like I just want that card art. That's all I want.
With just a voice bubble that says Murgle, period.
Right.
One night on Murgle Street. We need that. They gotta make that expansion.
It sounds amazing. I want Murloc Economist now.
Just call it. We gotta call up Ben. Be like, yo, we need Murloc Economist.
We got a pitch for you.
What about it's a 2-mana 2/2 in Paladin, and you discover a secret? I think that'd be really good. I could use more of that.
Probably like give you a coin, or something like that. Anyway,
that'd be cool.
So that would be cool. So average deck win rate is there's a lot of information there, but it's still very useful. But it is very field dependent, and it's not the final say on how good a card is at all. Because there's also player skill folded in here in all kinds of ways. So one way in which it's folded in is when a deck is like both competitive and new, people don't know how to play against it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so that could inflate its matchup win rates and thus its average deck win rates. So like if people don't know, you're playing a deck that looks like it's got a bunch of threats at like 2 and 3, but you have some serious threats at like 5 and 7, maybe Cobalt Scale, Bane of Bone Mare, but your opponents don't know that yet. They might blow a lot of their resources getting rid of your 2s and 3s, thinking you're going to run out of gas, but then you can sort of play these mid-rangey, high-value minions later. So I think something like that was happening with Tempo Rogue in sort of the early stages, where people weren't prepared for the types of threats that it was going to pump out, and that can inflate a deck's win rate.
Yeah, I think that's why it was so high. I guess a week or two ago. It's more of a normal number now.
Yeah, totally, because people know people have an idea of what's coming on each turn, and they can sequence their answers properly if they're playing an answer deck, or play the right threats for the situation if they're playing a threat deck.
And we had a whole. I guess we did about half of a episode talking about the resilience of that deck and how hard it is to even have a strategy that beats it. So it took people some time to gravitate towards decks that actually do that, because there aren't many, and it's certainly not obvious how to do that. But like how to build Zoo correctly with apparently like Blood Imp, that was not obvious to anybody, but apparently that's pretty good.
Sure.
And then so that evolution took longer because Tempo Rogue was harder to break, I guess. And that's why its win rate was so ridiculous at the beginning.
Yeah, it was a tough deck to beat. If you're trying to play a fair minion deck against it, you probably just get owned by minions that remove your minions.
And Scalebanes.
Yep, Scalebanes and Bone Mares.
Blue Eyes White Dragon.
It's definitely Blue Eyes White Dragon. So that's those are two important statistics. So I think that it's important to talk about where you should get this information. Not all average deck win rates are created equally. So part of the reason that we talk about websites like we hold in such high regard websites like VS and HS Replay is that these are unbiased samples. These are individuals choosing to contribute all of their data to VS. So, I basically have signed up my Trackabot so that whenever Trackabot's running and I'm playing Hearthstone, all of the games and the results that I play will be sent off to VS, regardless of the outcome, not just the ones that I look good in, not just the ones where a certain deck looks good, all of them. So the fact that it's unbiased means you can interpret all these statistics correctly. If you open up a statistics textbook and you start reading about samples and false positive rates and like statistical tests and all of that stuff, one of the first assumptions that it makes is that your sample is an unbiased and representative sample from a population distribution. That's a base level assumption of basically all inferential statistics, and what we're doing here is ultimately something like inferential statistics, and we could actually make it literally inferential statistiks by just taking these probabilities and putting a confidence interval on them. So
that sounds like a blast. Let's do it.
We're definitely going to be doing that in a little bit later. Actually, right now. So the one thing I wanted to talk about are advertised win rates on message boards. So
those are my favorite to use. That was sarcasm, guys.
So we all have an idea, right, that these have to be inflated. I mean, it's sort of, you can logic that pretty simply. So this is simple. Just whenever people post a deck on Reddit or Hearthstone, they'll probably advertise a win rate with it. There's a lot of you should pretty much never believe these, and that's I mean, you can have a community filled with extremely honest and extremely excitable people, and on the forum of that community, you would see a bunch of inflated, unbelievable win rates. And we're gonna sort of go into why that might be. So the obvious first factor here, the thing that a lot of people talk about, is sample size. So sample size is by no means all of the story, and we'll give you an example of why that might be. But obviously, sample size affects your confidence on probability estimates, or on estimates of anything. If you take an average number, as your sample size increases, your confidence that your average is representative will increase. And there's a lot of quantitative ways to describe that, confidence interval being one of them, where as your sample size increases, the range in which your true value is going to lie will sort of decrease, relative to your measured value. But ultimately, with sample size, you can compute something called standard error. And standard error is what you're using to get that confidence interval. Confidence interval is just a range where you expect a value to lie with some percentage. So if I had a 95% confidence interval, it'd be a range of numbers in which I expect the in this case a win rate to lie with like some probability. We'd say 95%. It's pretty standard. So anyway, so you need a good sample size, because otherwise your confidence interval could, like, you could say, oh man, this deck has like a 60% win rate, but if your sample size isn't high enough, your confidence interval might include, say, 50%.
Yeah, like so if your sample size is small, like 15 games, for example, which is very small.
Very small.
But like that's potentially hours of your life. So let's be realistic about this 15 number. That could also it could take you, a human, a long time to collect data from 15 games. And but what you want to know, like, or like, and let's say your win rate was 70% out of those 15 games. If you go then post that on the internet, the way people interpret it is that the deck, like, on large average, wins 70%. So, like, against any random player on average on the rank ladder. So, out of potentially millions of people, not 15.
Right.
Not those specific 15 people, but the other millions of people, it will also win 70% of the time. And you can kind of see how that's a stretch. You know, I played against these 15 people, and I won 70% of the time. So when I play against the other couple million people, I'll also win 70% of the time. Like, that's obviously not true.
Totally.
That is very misleading. And you would really only be able to talk about how you could do against those millions of people if you at least had a number much more relatively sizable.
Yeah,
and that's what Hearthstone Deck Tracker and VS look at are numbers, because they're not just individual humans. You know, they have algorithms and computers that are figured out and are capable of analyzing, you know, many times the number of games that one person could.
Yeah, certainly. So that's one of the big advantages of them, and the fact that it's unbiased. But the sample size is really huge here. So, because even if you collected an individual sample, there's obviously a high potential for bias, but you're also just probably not going to get to a sizable sample. But I think that, like, what we think is a sizable sample is often not as sizable as we might think. So let's say I played 100 games. That's a lot, right? 100, and
that's a long time.
That's a long time. I mean, I don't have all the golden classes, and to get a golden class, you need, like, 500 wins, so that's about 1,000 games. It's sizable. That's a pretty considerable fraction. That's going to be a lot of hours. So let's say you played a deck for 100 games and you measured a 60% win rate. So that's 100 games, and 60, like we said, is really good. So you might think, like, this is it. I found it. I found the deck.
Mm-hmm.
Let's compute the confidence interval. So what we do is we compute the error on our estimate, and then we basically add that error scaled by some factor to our 60%, and also subtract it from that 60%. And those two numbers will be the upper and lower bounds, respectively, of our confidence interval. So for a 60% win rate, if you want to know, you want a range where you can be sure the true win rate lies, and you can be 95% sure that it's in that range. That range is from 50% to 70%. So even though you have 100 games with this deck, and even though you measured this astronomical 60% win rate, 50% is one of the numbers that this could feasibly be. This could be the actual win rate of the deck. It could be 50.
Yeah, like, there's a 95% chance that it's in that area.
Yes.
And basically half of that area is below your 60%.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really only you're less than 50% certain that it's 60 or higher is the reality of it.
Yeah, that's the idea. So it's or you're exactly 50% certain. But that's the idea here, is that this range is probably a little bigger than you thought. You know, even though you have a what is a respectable sample size among these communities. You know, I think in order to advertise a win rate in your post's title on the competitive Reddit, you need 100 games. So that's like a heralded win rate. There's still a huge error on this estimate.
And so then let's, like, also consider like what ranks. Like, if you were winning, you changed ranks maybe multiple times.
Yeah, that's the other one.
You know, like, what deck were you playing? Did you use the same deck all 100 games? What time of the day were you playing? Like as you played those 100 games, the meta changed. Like there's so many things wrong with that 100 game sample from the human.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's a really good point. Is that if you played 100 games with a 60% win rate, chances are you went from like 17 to like 1 or legend or something. Like you did a big climb, and those wins, like what was your win rate in from 5 to 1? It was probably okay. You got to legend or whatever, but maybe it wasn't 60%, and maybe you should be a little bit more careful about how you're considering the games that you played at rank 17, because it's different players, different distribution of decks, a lot of different factors there. Different cards in the decks, less tuned, maybe less teched out, less modern decks.
And so then, if this were how we were gonna get our statistics, we would never have matchup win rates. It's not like you get to pick what deck you're gonna play against, so you wouldn't be able to get 100 tempo rogue versus priest. If we wanted to, we need to play many more than 100 games to get 100 of those.
Oh yeah, an individual matchup. Yes,
that's just another huge awesome thing about VS and other things that are working with databases and unbiased algorithms are producing the statistics rather than humans. It's not just that we don't like people. That's not the only reason.
It's that when you're talking about statistics, having an unbiased sample and having a lot of data is those are the two best things you could have. And sites like VS and HS Replay have a monopoly on that. There's not really a lot of super good open data options for Hearthstone. There is one option. I think the people who do Trackabot have a database, but I've looked at the data. It's not as good as the data that VS gets from you. It's not as good as the data that HS Replay gets from you. And there's not nearly as much of it. But
and yet, these more matters. The size does matter here, and having a really big Hearthstone database would be really valuable and really useful.
Yep. It's something that these groups have a monopoly on, and it allows them to do what they do. So I want to give you, I mentioned confidence interval a lot. That's something we talked about a lot, and it's a useful construct because it tells you where you can be, quote unquote sure, or at least X% sure that your estimate, the true variable you're trying to estimate, the true win rate, lies in that range. So just to give you a sort of heuristic that you could use in your everyday life, actually, this applies to probabilities everywhere, not just Hearthstone. This is a big simplification, so these numbers are nowhere near exact. This is a heuristic. Let's say you have a 50-game sample size. If your deck's measured win rate, so in those 50 games, you measured a win rate between 50 and 70%, then you can add and subtract 13% from your win rate, and that'll give you the upper and lower bounds of your confidence interval.
Okay.
So
that's not too bad.
It's not too bad. If you measure 9% would be for 100 games. So if you play 100 games and then you measure some win rate, you can add and subtract 9% to give you the upper and lower bounds on your confidence interval. So again, the exact sort of half width of the confidence interval depends on the measured win rate, because it depends on the standard error, which depends on the measured win rate. But that's why I say that, this is a good heuristic for a win rate between 50 and 70%, which are, or I guess also 30 to 70%, really. But that's sort of a useful range, and most of our win rates will lie in that range. Most of the ones that we care to compute a confidence interval about. So there's one more caveat with advertised win rates on message boards that we wanted to bring up. So when people report these win rates, there's a massive selection bias in which ones are reported, such that these are not random samples of win rates. And actually, they're hard to believe, and you can't even do the confidence interval trick that we just talked about. You can't even apply that to an advertised win rate and get a range. That's not even going to be enough to account for this. So what is this selection bias? Basically, if you play a deck, you make a deck and you want it to be really good, and you go and play and it wins 50% of the time, you're not going to post about it.
Exactly.
And if you make a deck and you go and play and you win 70% of your games, you're definitely going to go post about it. So what this means is that even if your win rate was say your true win rate with that deck was 50%, let's say you're actually decent at building decks.
Let's just pretend.
Yeah, let's just pretend. With some probability, you're going to win 70% of the games in your sample. You know, it's a non-zero probability, and if you roll the dice, you might just get there. So then that percentage of the time is going to be the percentage of the time that you post about your deck on the message board, even though it has a 50% win rate. So if you imagine there's a lot of people brewing a lot of decks, and this process is operating for all of them, then you're going to have a message board filled with amazingly high advertised win rates for amazingly mediocre decks.
Yeah, exactly. Given like a terrible deck, but enough sets of 20, eventually you can get a set of 20 where you win all 20 games.
Yeah, exactly. It's non-zero. Probability's not zero.
Even if the deck is like just like really bad. And yeah, that was something I thought, well, like, how often does somebody even post a deck that wins 49% of games? Like,
never. You're not like, man, I posted, like, this deck ran good 49, but it ran really good in the games it won, so I think it's good, and post about it. Like, their posts would get buried.
Yeah, and ironically, that could be, like, a much better deck.
Yeah, absolutely.
The ones with the 80% win rate or whatever.
The opposite's true here, too. You could have a deck with a true win rate of 55, and then, like, you play it and you roll, like, 45, and you're like, man, this deck sucks, you know?
Yeah, I think that definitely happens sometimes, too, and part of that might be when a deck is weird. Like, if you've never... If you're not that experienced and don't know how it works, and you pick up Rizakis, and it seems to have this high win rate, and then you lose a bunch of times, well, it's not the deck.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's a factor there. But so to give you an intuition for this selection bias, we did an back of the envelope calculation.
My favorite.
So yeah, it's the best kind. So let's say that you have a person or many people, and they advertise all decks that win 60% of their games. So let's say you have a community, and in this community, every time a deck wins 60% or more of the games, they'll advertise it. And let's say that each of them play 100 different decks with 100 games. In this community, 100 different decks are played for 100 games each. So You basically have 100 runs of 100 game samples. The probability, and let's make an additional assumption here, that the true win rate of each of these decks is 50%. All of the decks that we're talking about right now are coin flip decks. You just have 100 people playing 100 games with coin flip decks. There's an 84% chance that at least one of those decks will have a measured win rate above 60%.
That's
the selection bias. And that's way more. That's so much. 84% so high. That's almost like, that's so good. So that one's going to go on that forum. That 50% win rate deck is going to get posted on a message board, and somebody's going to say, I won 60% of my games with Jade Rogue. And that's the one we're going to see. We're not going to see the other ones, even though all of these decks have true win rates of 50%.
And there could even easily be one deck in there that had like it was the 155% deck, and they just don't have good games.
Yep,
like that could
totally.
We could even try and stretch it further, and then it still the 50% deck that got lucky is the one that winds up being on the forum, even when we introduce a better deck.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, adding that in there, saying like you have 99 decks that are 50% and one 55% deck, it wouldn't increase the measured win rate by it wouldn't increase the chance that at least one of them has 60% win rate by that much. But also, the probability that you don't observe a 60% or higher win rate for that deck is going to be lower than 50.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to happen less than half the time. But
Not much
anyway,
less.
This is like, yeah, how much less is exactly what you could calculate. So this is ultimately to give you an intuition that like this selection bias is huge. I think that like that example above is really, when I was working out that calculation, it was like a little higher than I thought it would be. 84% is pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately these win rates on message boards all have this process operating under beneath them. So it's not that the people who are posting are lying. They're not at all. They're probably like honest people who really think they have a good deck. It's just that they're lucky in their selection bias. So they're gonna they're going to be posting about their mediocre decks. So unfortunately for us, I made a bunch of assumptions in order to get at that number. I had to know the number of decks that are being played, the number of games that are each being played, and the true win rate of a deck, which is not something you can ever really know.
Yeah.
It is computationally intractable to compute the true win rate of any given deck. But
for now,
I made all those. Yeah, for now, we might get there with quantum computing. So I made a bunch of assumptions to get at that 84% number, and from there I could probably reverse engineer how I'm supposed to shift my confidence interval on an advertised win rate. But unfortunately, us viewing these forums can make no such assumptions. We have no idea how many people are liable to post. We have no idea how many games all of them are playing on average, and we don't know the true win rates of these decks. So we can't arrive at that 84% number. We just have to assume that these are hyper inflated win rates.
And that's not to say you might be able to find something good or interesting on there, but when it comes to like something like that, like people just posting deck lists, generally I'm looking more for like ideas than actual deck lists. Like, oh, what is this person doing with their priest? Oh, they're using Auctioneer and Lyra. That looks fun. I get to give that a spin, and not actually use that exact list, but get an idea for something to do, and usually not really paying very much, like not even looking at if there's an advertised win rate or something like that. I don't look at it. I just assume it's positive because they posted the deck, right? Like that deck wouldn't be there if it were negative, so I don't even read that number. That number, like we said, barely means anything. But I can tell, like, if there's a picture of them getting legendary and they're posting about it, it's probably at least got something going on, and then taking a look at that can be helpful. But just like snatching complete deck lists that way can be sort of not an accurate way to pick your deck.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. I think that this is a great place to go and get inspired or find a fun deck that you can play, but it's not the way to find the meta breaker. If you really want win rate data, you need to look at unbiased samples. You need to look at samples where not just the ones who get 60% or more are going to post their win rates, but the ones who get lower than that are also going to post their win rates, and that's an unbiased sample by definition, and that's going to be something like what HS Replay or VS is working with.
And big unbiased samples, ideally.
huge unbiased samples, yeah. Especially if you want matchup win rate data. Just knowing a deck went 9-2 is not enough. There's massive error on that estimate of win rate probability.
One thing to be said, I think, maybe for looking at a deck that somebody posted and got a lot of views, or maybe a deck that did really well in the tournament, is that other people will probably copy it.
Yeah.
So I think that might be one of the biggest things you can get from looking at a deck list that is getting improperly hyped, is be like, I might see this now, and now I know what it is. If my opponent plays, like a Netherspite Historian turn 2 and they're playing Rogue, I have an idea what's going to happen later, and I can not get beaten by this janky deck.
Right. You could just go back to that forum post and click on the link and look at the list, and you know what to play around.
Exactly. That's a definitely, or and I think that's a common thing when someone wins a big tournament. People will copy that person's decks, even though that often hardly makes any sense, because if you're playing a tournament, what you need to do is very different from ladder.
Totally.
But then they wind up making that, what I just said, less true when people copy their decks.
Yep. Yeah. It's funny. Actually, then you could play the teched out version of the other decks that are supposed to beat that one. It's bizarre. It's true though. I mean, tournament decks are obviously different from ladder decks. That's definitely true.
Seeing them can give you an update on what other people will probably be copying and pasting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a lot of people are going to see, oh, Rozakis that won Worlds, let's play that one. And maybe there is some relevant stuff there, but there might also just be like 2 Galaka Crawlers in the Singleton Priest deck.
And 2 Hungry Crabs.
Oh yeah, maybe even 2 Hungry Crabs.
And 2 Weasel Tunnelers.
So, 2 Weasel Tunnelers.
That card has a drawn win rate of 100%.
This is factually true.
In all decks.
In every deck. You have to play
including
it.
poker.
Win. Yeah, including Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you so those are a bunch of, average deck statistics, like stats about entire decks. Let's talk about some stats about individual cards. This is something that HS Replay does and is like pretty cool. It's really awesome that they have enough data
It's pretty cool.
To compute these probabilities, but these are even tougher to interpret than the average deck win rates. Interpreting deck win rates and stuff is child's play compared to interpreting card win rates. So the two we wanted to talk about here are drawn versus played win rates. These are different from each other. They mean different things, and one is a little bit more trustworthy than the other.
What do they mean, Bart?
So drawn win rate is just how likely are you to win if you draw a particular card at some point during the game. For example, Weasel Tunneler, if you draw that at some point in your game, you're going to win that game for sure, 100%.
Yeah, I've never seen anyone lose when they draw Weasel Tunneler. So
yeah, same here. I've also never seen anyone win, but that's different. So
these are called biased samples.
Right, exactly. So this does fold a lot of information together. There's a lot of information in a drawn win rate statistic, but it is ultimately a very helpful one. So it's helpful because it considers the cases where you play the cards, but also the games where you don't play the card. So you can imagine if you had a 9-mana card that you played, and it's basically 9 mana to win the game, but every deck in the format beats you on turn 6, that card would have a really high played win rate, but it would have a really dismal drawn win rate.
Yeah, so the played win rate is how often you win a game that you played that card.
Yes.
And that is like definitely really helpful too. But when you're looking at something like an expensive card, I think is one of the best situations, or maybe like a more like niche card or a more tricky card, like you're going to try using a betrayal or something like that. The drawn win rate is excellent because you can see how often it just sat there and did nothing, essentially, which is really hard to measure. The kind of stuff that you won't remember is when the card was sitting there and doing nothing. You'll remember whatever you did win with that game or whatever you lost to. And you will, when you do draw it and play it and it works, those memories will be emphasized. So the amount of times the card actually sits there and it could have been something much better is pretty hard to judge just like as a person eyeballing it. The drawn win rate on more expensive or more clunky cards, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. It's our brains are not really tuned to take advantage of those events and that information because one, when it just sits in your head and does nothing, that's not an emotionally salient event at all. It's just not the kind of thing that your brain tends to encode. But also, it requires some amount of counterfactual reasoning because you have to, if you want to sort of make good on that event, you have to think, okay, well, what if that card was this card? What if that card was this card? Well, then on this turn, I could have done that instead, and then this would have gone this way, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually really difficult to do that. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not like free, It takes a lot of effort to think that through. So that's not something that your brain's just going to do automatically. But what it will do automatically is, wow, I played this card and crushed my opponent.
Oh, this Weasel Tunneler destroyed this guy.
Yeah. This guy just I played this Weasel Tunneler, I duplicated in his deck, and then his Reno didn't work. Those are like things like that you're gonna remember.
That card's obviously really good now.
Yeah, totally. It's the tech. So it's important to look at drawn win rate and not just played win rate for that reason. And drawn win rate is nice because it's a statistic that you can compute from a large sample that is tough for us to get a handle on just thinking about a card. It can be slightly misleading, though. So there is one caveat. It's very useful, but if you can imagine, let's think about your deck's average win rate and think about it in terms of individual cards, because that's what a deck is. It's going to be the weighted sum of the drawn win rates, right? It's going to be how often you draw a particular card, and you're going to add together those drawn win rates, and that's going to give you the deck. Ish, maybe. That might not even be totally true. But what that means is, let's say everybody was playing a deck. What that means is that some of those are going to be fine cards that should be in your deck because they're sort of the glue that binds your deck together, even though their drawn win rate is lower than your deck's average win rate. So, you can arrive at this paradox where a card that's like a staple or something that you're drawing in most games appears to actually be mediocre according to your drawn win rate. It's just that some cards are going to be worse and some cards are going to be better. So just because a card has a drawn win rate that is lower than your deck's average win rate does not mean that that card is bad. That is not the right way to interpret that statistic.
Yeah, I think you were saying that like Bloodlust had a below 50% drawn win rate or something like that.
It's not below 50%, but it's below the deck's average. Yeah, it's below the deck's average win rate. So the played win rate of Bloodlust is really high. Why is that? Well, because you play it and win on the spot.
Yeah.
Like, that's when you play this card, the times you cast this card are the games you're winning with it.
That's a big bias about the played win rate.
Totally.
Like, Shadow Reaper Anduin. Like, how often do you win when you play that card? Most of the time, probably. But that's because you played Shadow Reaper Anduin. You got to 8 mana. It's much more useful, like, for that card. I mentioned, look at the drawn win rate, and with Bloodlust, once again, if you're playing it, you're probably winning.
Yeah, and the played win rate somewhere in the 70s. It's really high. The drawn win rate is like 1% lower than your deck's average win rate. But like, so it's tough to interpret that.
It doesn't mean it's bad. Like, it definitely doesn't just straight up mean it's bad.
Yes, exactly. That toy example is to tell you that doesn't mean the Bloodlust is bad and you should remove it, because if you replaced it with another card that had a better drawn win rate than some other cards that are good will look bad or not, or your deck's win rate will just go down because you cut a stable card. But so even though Bloodlust's drawn win rate is sort of mediocre and its played win rate's really good, it's still a staple in the deck and you should still have at least one. But that's an important difference between this played win rate here and this drawn win rate, and that's a big caveat in dealing with the drawn win rate and trying to think about that. So that's a misleading one because it looks like a nice, pure, really good statistic, but there is that small thing you have to keep in mind.
And so ideally you're looking at both of these numbers for a card, but looking at these numbers can be helpful if you're trying to make a cut or something like that. And like, what's not really as important as I think it is, and this might make it seem like, well, maybe I don't need 2 Bloodlusts. Maybe I'm fine with 1. I need to be able to do it. It's a critical part of my deck, but maybe it's not as, just getting, more taunts out might work better in the current meta than trying to blow people up.
Definitely.
There's definitely been like a sort of gradual slide to board control decks, and just keeping the board and having minions and sticking minions, and so the significance of that could maybe make having the Bloodlust less important. So this can inspire you to find a card. Oh, I don't really need that as much as I thought I did.
Yeah, totally. This is definitely a good place to go if you want to see where the tech slots are. You want to see how you can change a deck, or if you like a deck's core package, but you want to do something else with the rest of it, then these are good stats to look at because you can see it'll help you get an idea of what really is part of the core package. Other than just thinking about how the deck works. But,
especially if you're going to start getting really crazy and doing something like Jade Rogue, you can look at Tempo Rogue and you might need to take out a bunch of stuff. So taking out a bunch of stuff without, cutting around the vital organs without cutting the vital organs, using that precision, these numbers would help with that.
Definitely. It's certainly not like the end of it. There's a lot more thinking you need to do because knowing about there's other statistics that we just don't have access to that nobody computes right now, which are like pairwise card win rates. What's the probability you win given that you drew both of these cards together?
Oh, that goes deep down into why you need to think much more about what cards to cut, because I heard someone say this once about Magic, but I'll say it about Hearthstone. There are no Hearthstone cards. There's just groups of cards. There's just relations of cards. And when you look at SI7 Agent, it's really as good because of how it interacts with the other several hundred cards, and not just because of its self standing alone on some plateau somewhere. And so for every single card, you need to, you don't need to consider every single other card, but you need to basically consider every other card in every other deck. So that's a lot of relationships. And that are all going to be relevant in addition to the drawn win rate and the played win rate. So that really is something that complicates the cutting decisions and then what to put in. And then something that would be very useful, this pairwise statistic that basically tries to solve that problem of the many, many, many relationships that there are.
Yeah, and I mean, it's thinking about that one and what the right way to compute that statistic is like, it's already giving me a headache. It's not straightforward. There's a lot of statistics that we don't get that would matter a lot, but there is also a lot that we don't get that don't matter. But yeah, certainly card relationships is something that you have to consider that is not easy to consider with the available data and the available statistics, the available analyses of the available data.
But at what, like, the played win rate and drawn win rate at least give you an idea, because they tell you about how, like, that card works with the other 29 cards in the deck against the current meta, which is, like, some of the most relevant information.
Yeah, it's still really useful.
Yeah, definitely.
None of these, all of the, with the exception of maybe the advertised win rates on message boards, I think all of these stats are useful despite their caveats. It's just important to know the caveats so that you can, think about how to adjust what might look like an insane number into something a little bit more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think that's actually a good place where we can sort of move into a bit of a summary. We talked about a lot of stuff, matchup win rates versus average win rates, the win rates on message boards, and drawn versus played. And a lot of this, we said already. I think the overall kind of summary of what we were talking about is that matchup win rates are informative. They're only a piece of the information, but they're maybe one of the purest and least sort of tainted pieces of information you can get about a deck's performance. Mm-hmm. The overall win rate has a lot folded into it. It's still useful because it tells you how good the deck is against the field, but the matchup is going to be a little bit more pure. Average advertised win rates on message boards, you should basically just not read those. You should write and send to me a Chrome add-on that just blocks those out. Those are not useful. There's too much bias that goes into it, even if all of the people mean well and they don't want to add fake information to their community. By nature of something like selection bias, by nature of what's going to be upvoted and what's not going to be upvoted, only the inflated ones will get there.
Yeah, the Chrome add-on would just convert whatever number they have to, quote, about 50%, unquote.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what I want.
That'd be excellent.
The win rate, about 50%. It's perfect. And as far as played and drawn win rates go, I guess this would be the other conclusion. The drawn win rate is that's going to tell you a little bit more about the cases that are harder for you to think about, the ones where you don't play a card, where it sits in your hand and it's not useful. The played win rate is going to be like when you played it and blew your opponent out, but that's only going to happen in some games. In the other games, you didn't play it. So
yeah, and certain cards, I think, like that are staples. It's worth looking at how much of staples are they. Like, is the played win rate really, really high in SI7 Agent? Maybe lately it's been going down because more people are ready for it, or Tar Creeper, or South Sea Captain. And then you can consider replacing that card with something that would actually work better.
Yes, right, exactly. Do you think that's a good place to wrap up?
I just wanted to reiterate how helpful it is to look at what your particular rank is playing. Because that's really how the matchup win rate becomes super helpful, is when you look at specifically what you, the individual, will be playing against, rather than looking at an average overall rank. So that's how you really can use that information to give you an edge.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think
that that's how you can sort of unfold it. We're talking about how these numbers can have things folded into them, and this gives you an opportunity to unfold some of that and look at it more clearly.
Right, exactly. Player skill is one of the factors that's folded into these win rates, and that's a good way to sort of mitigate that a little bit. At least see what the effect of that is. Obviously, it's not quite that simple. There's still more caveats with that, but it's getting better and getting as good as you need to are two different things, and the former is fine.
Yeah, we're all doing the best we can.
Exactly. So if you want to do the best that you can, you can find us on twitter.com/lastturnhs, facebook.com/lastturnhs. You can find us, of course, on iTunes. We're always there. On Stitcher, on soundcloud.com/lastturn. That's where we sort of primarily host our stuff, but gets beamed out to all those other places. You can check out our YouTube channel. We upload our episodes there in sort of video format with the audio playing. So if you prefer to use YouTube to listen to this stuff, you totally can. Totally can. So another thing I wanted to call out is our intro and outro song is done by Psyche Corporation.
Oh, yeah.
So that's PSYCHE Corporation. So if you want to check her out, you can go to psychecorp.bandcamp.com. She has a lot of really cool music there. You should check her out.
Definitely.
If you like her, you can check out her... I think she has a Patreon, actually. So you can check out her Patreon as well. But definitely check that out. And we hope that you are encountering a lot of really good statistics, and with what we taught you, you know how to interpret them and convert them into improving your own win rate.
Yeah, I hope the numbers treat you well.
Same here, and the coins, because it's Hearthstone. But we'll see you next turn.
See you next turn.